You're listening to Help Me, I'm a Comedian. It's a show where we ask a comedian to come in and share a topic of pain or difficulty from their life, and a psychologist helps out, offers a bit of insight into the subject. Mark Grimes is an improv comedian, and he's joining you now along with psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam. Hello to you both.
Hi, Ashwin.
Hello, Ashwin.
Mark has a comedy character called Randy P. Pickles, who you'll hear more about later, and the role that Randy has played in recovery for Mark and healing in what he's gone through. The reason we've invited Mark in is he has had to deal with, unfortunately, the loss of a few very important people in his life. He has lost a partner last year during the COVID crisis, and also his brother much earlier on in life. So we thought we'd invite him in to talk about loss and what has helped him to move through it. Mark, can you start by telling us your story, the story of your partner?
Chris and I were together for just shy of 16 years, and at the beginning of the pandemic last year, 2020, he completed a contract he was working on and went to New Zealand for a 6-week holiday, and then to spend time with his family. And during that time, ended up staying in New Zealand due to the lockdown. And Chris had some, significant anxiety, which certainty was a really important thing for him. And unfortunately, there was no certainty with the COVID pandemic, and it was hard for him to see when he was going to come back to Brisbane, to be back with me, to get back to our house together. And essentially, the cacophony of uncertainty led to Chris taking his life in June 2020. And that was something that I never thought I would have to face. It wasn't something that we ever talked about potentially occurring. When Chris went through his anxiety, it ended up being catastrophizing things quite often. Yeah. So we developed this, as partners do, we developed this strategy on how to work through that, which started with open questioning to come back from the catastrophization.
Yeah. And that had worked many times.
Yeah, it worked many times. But I think that being at the end of a phone or at the end of a FaceTime is quite difficult compared to being in the same place together.
Yeah.
So some of the markers that you might see when you're in a room together or in the same place together is really hard to pick up on at the end of a phone. So I spoke to him the night before, and everything seemed normal, for want of a better word.
You didn't pick up on any clues?
No, it was just like we talked every day, we texted multiple times, and there was no real difference in that conversation. And then it was the following day we'd arranged to have a call, and I tried to call him, and he wasn't available. It's a very hard thing to go through when you're stuck on one side of the Tasman and he's on the other side of the Tasman, and it happens, and then you have to go through all of these ridiculous processes to get there, just to get to a traumatic event that is significant. It was a nightmare. And then 2 weeks quarantine in Auckland, in a hotel, in a room, on your own. But I was very fortunate that Chris's family were in New Zealand, so I was able to speak to them during the day. My family are in Scotland. I could speak to them during the night. I made a very distinct decision not to drink alcohol whilst I was in that situation, simply because I know it amplifies the feelings that you have. Yeah. And it's hard enough doing it without alcohol to then layer that on top.
Because it came as such a shock to you, can you talk about the impact that it had and whether it was magnified by the fact that you didn't expect it?
The initial feeling was I was at home, and I remember after being told what had happened, going upstairs and just wondering, what is this place? What is this house? What is it? What does it mean now? It's lost all meaning. Even though Chris wasn't there prior to it happening, it was our place, and that was a stark pain to start with, and then
very surreal.
Because for me, he hadn't been there for 12, 15 weeks. So it wasn't like he was there for me and then he wasn't in that space. So that was quite difficult to deal with because the physical place didn't change. You know, it was the emotional space that changed instantly.
Altered state of consciousness.
Yeah. And that was incredibly hard to deal with. And I have very good friends, and Chris's friends as well, very good friends together that rallied round very quickly and came to help me, you know, because I couldn't have done that without that support. And that was vital to have someone there, multiple people there that were just...
could function.
Equally devastated as I was, but just there. That support is vital. The trauma of having to just leave and not knowing what's happening, you know, not knowing what's happening, where you're going. You know you're going to a place, but you don't know what you're going to face, and you don't know how people are going to be, and your brain goes fuzzy. How do I move forward? What do I do now?
Yeah.
What's my next step here? Because I don't know. So, you know, you need that help for someone to take you.
Did you go into that self-care mindset quite early? I need to stay focused. I need to fix this. I need to get some clarity. Or were you happy to just sit in that fuzziness of the loss of meaning and the loss of where do we go from here?
I'm not good at sitting in those sort of situations. I'm not the kind of person that will just sit in something. I have to be doing something, so I have to be actively participating in solving, and that's the wrong word. You know, I wasn't solving anything, but it was the way I had to participate. I had to do something rather than sit. You're trying to make sense of something you didn't expect, and you have to break it down into little pieces. The one thing that was really beneficial of being in isolation in a hotel was I was able to read a lot and watch. There's some very good resources on the internet for what's termed victims of suicide. So that's people who are left bereaved as the result of someone taking their own life. And there was some very interesting commentary that I got from people who had been in a similar position. The fact of grief being a spiral rather than it being a linear process. So you continually revisit things. So you start off potentially remembering, you know, events and things that occurred whilst you were together, and you'll pass through that, but you'll come back to it again.
Yes.
And it may be slightly less deep than the previous time, but it's continuing in a spiral, and that will always occur.
Yeah, it's a part of you now.
Yeah, it is. It's a continuous part of me, and that will always be there.
Rachel, I've heard you say something similar, a ball in a box, and it's very concentrated at the start, grief, but then it doesn't collide with the edges of the box. So frequently, as time passes on, it's still always a part of you. I'm not sure if I've done justice to your metaphor, but is there something you would like to say about the grieving process that perhaps people don't understand as they're entering it?
I think it's an excellent point that you make, Mark, about circling the truth of our lives and of what's happened to try and make sense of it and process it and integrate it or incorporate it into your life story. I think that's, you know, I've seen that in my clinical practice over and over. And, the imagery that you're talking about, Ashwin, is that, you know, grief is that ball and it's in a container, a small container at first, so it's filling most of the container. There's not much space for anything else. And over time, the ball doesn't get smaller, the container gets bigger. So you actually can contain it better. You can make space for it. There's you know, other parts of your life start to come back, but the grief, it doesn't go away. Does that resonate for you at all, Mark?
Yeah, totally it does. The grief is always there. It becomes less noisy over time.
That point Mark raised about numbness, Rachel, if someone has just lost someone and they're dealing with that numbness, what would you suggest about dealing with numbness? Trying to go into an action plan straight away or sitting in that numbness? What do you tell clients that you're talking to?
Well, I normalise it because it seems to be what happens to most people. I think it's evolution's way, you know, nature's way of helping us take action and get some things sorted. You know, if the numbness isn't just because we've lost someone to death, it can be a divorce or something else, you know, and in the beginning, when something's just happened, when there's been that loss, often there's a lot to do. You know, in your case, you had to get across the Tasman and deal with all the bureaucracy. You know, someone who's going through divorce has to maybe find somewhere else to live and sort out some legals and, you know, a bunch of other things. So the numbness, in a way, is helping us to do the tasks. You know, but what I would say to people who are still in the numb phase or the disbelief and shock phase is it will hit you, and probably quite randomly and out of the blue, you know, over and over again. Was that your experience, Mark?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And, you know, there are things that occur. We went on holiday as a family together after Chris passed, and everybody went off to bed together. And, you know, the totally normal family going to bed, and I was left on my own in the living room. And that hit me massively at the time to go, wow, this is exactly the time that we should have been going together. Yeah. And that was a huge moment, which was not expected.
Yeah.
And that's one that I often return to, just go, that was so significant, such a tiny thing
but it hit you.
That meant such a massive impact on me.
Yeah.
Other people's lives continue, and you become resentful to that for a while. I certainly did become resentful of the fact that everybody else just was able to continue doing what they did.
Yeah.
And that was quite frustrating. Yeah. And I realise it now, looking back, that it was not their fault that their life went on. It was the fact that what had happened to me had caused the trauma that meant that I perceived that as something which was wrong.
Some cultures don't speak of a person once they've passed away, and others, I'm sure, speak of them more. Do you find that it was easier for you to cut out any reminders, like sitting alone on the couch, or to keep the reminders there because that's a way of keeping Chris in your life still?
I love having things around me. I think that that's a really important part of me. You know, Chris's things and my things, you know, they're synonymous. From very early on, I made it a goal of mine that it wasn't going to be something that I shy away from. I think it's important to talk about Chris. He's a very significant part of who I am, and that's what it was, and he always will be, and it's important to talk to other people about that.
I'd like to ask you about going to New Zealand as well. You ended up there for 7 months as well, which is quite a dramatic change from the life you had here. Can you tell us how that happened?
I'm a Kiwi citizen, so I lived in New Zealand from 1997 to 2008, and then Chris and I both moved to Brisbane. When I went back to New Zealand, because of the border lockdowns and quarantine, I didn't want to go to New Zealand, do all the things that needed to happen around funerals, etc., and then just come back, because I needed to spend time over there with family to go through the grieving process. So I decided that I was going to stay for a while, and then a while turned into 7 months. After about 4 months, I realised that I had to start doing things. You know, I had to start going back to work. So I have my own business here, so I was working remotely, but I wasn't working remotely for the first 4 months of being in New Zealand, and I realised, well, I actually have to start contributing back to that. And then I also realised that I needed to reconnect with my artistic endeavours. I felt that I needed to get back into comedy and improv and having an outlet which was something that brought me genuine, pure joy.
We've often looked into what the benefit of comedy is on this podcast because we've had so many comedians come in. Is it therapeutic? Is it just a bit of fun? What role does comedy play in your life?
Improvisational comedy particularly is such a collaborative event that you're working with beautiful people that are wanting to have a great time, and that collaboration makes you completely forget about everything else that's going on within any realm of your life. And being in the moment, being there, being in flow, being present and going, this is the best distraction that I could ever have, and as a bonus, I'm making people laugh and I'm having a fun time. I was able to get into a community that was really supportive and collaborative, and that was really a good way of getting back into doing things outside and in the world again.
You're listening to Help Me, I'm a Comedian on ABC Radio with improviser and comedian Mark Grimes and psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam. What role does having a ritual play in recovering from grief? Some cultures have a ritual period of mourning. Does that help to ritualize the grieving process? And then I'll ask Mark you the same question.
I have two friends who've lost children, which is, pretty unusual. I'm thinking of how they coped with it. They both lost babies, young babies, and one of my friends has continued with the rituals around losing her daughter. And there are photos around the house, and she makes a birthday cake every year and visits the cemetery, and a whole lot of ritual. And my other friend, made a little box of things and had told me she's not opened it since she lost her daughter. And, she rarely speaks about the experience. And just watching my two friends cope with a very similar experience in very different ways. And I would say that they've each adjusted and grieved, but in different ways. Also reminds me, about individual differences. We are all different as well. You spoke about the resentment towards, looking on as everybody got on with their lives in their everyday state of consciousness when this has happened to you. And there's something about birth and death which I think puts us in an altered state of consciousness. I remember when I gave birth to my first child, looking out the window of the Royal Brisbane Hospital down onto the street, and you had dysphoria, deep despair, and I had euphoria because I just brought a new person into the world. And I remember thinking, how are they all just walking down the street? I've just had a baby. And then, of course, at some point, I kind of transitioned into the mundane, everyday, normal state of consciousness again. I wonder, what was your process for coming back into that more sort of that reality of everyday consciousness, Mark?
When I came back to Brisbane, whilst in New Zealand, I was in, as much as it was not a COVID bubble, it was kind of a COVID bubble. So I had this life that was going on there, which involved some work remotely, but not real work. And it was only when I got back to Brisbane and into the house, and it was like, oh, hang on. Right. So this is what reality is.
You're listening to comedian, improviser Mark Grimes and psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam. Mark is sharing his story of loss with us today. There was another loss in your life, Mark. That was someone you didn't actually get to meet. Can you tell us that story?
Back in 1975, I'm showing my age here, I had a brother who was 15 who passed of a brain tumour a week before I was born. He had been ill for about 18 months. Initially, they thought it was the flu, and then they thought it was meningococcal meningitis, and discovered that it was a brain tumour. He went through a significant illness and operations, several operations, and passed away a week before I was born. So I was the 4th of September. He was the 29th of August that he passed away, which would have been immensely traumatic for my mum and dad at the time.
Can only imagine.
And I've spoken to my mum about this quite recently because I knew we were going to be talking today about it. She said that, yes, it was an incredibly traumatic time when it happened. Mum was very much adamant when I was born. The nurse said to her, when one door closes, another one opens. And my mum told me just last week, I turned to the nurse and I said, oh, these are two very different people. This is a very different person. So she was adamant that it wasn't sort of a replacement.
No.
And so she was very, very adamant at that time that, no, this is the different person completely.
Do you know anything about the environment in the house when you were born into? Were they having to pretend to be happy for that first week, or have they told you about what it was like back then?
They didn't, and I haven't discussed it because it wasn't really something that ever sprang to mind for me to think about that. And in fact, you mentioning it now, I've just thought, I wonder what it was like that first week. Do you know
if she grieved, if she had a delayed kind of a grief?
Well, I know that her and my dad were, they were incredibly close, and it brought them closer together. So a tragic death can either blow you apart or bring you closer together, depending on how you react to it. And it brought them closer together. And yes, they were grieving whilst they were looking after me, but it wasn't as explicit as it potentially would have been had they not had a newborn in the house at the time. My mum is a very resilient person, and so was my father. He passed away many years ago. Her resilience, and whether it's nature or nurture, I don't know.
A bit of both.
A bit of both. The resilience that my mum and dad had has become part of our family vernacular.
Yeah.
It just seems to be something that we all have.
You've said a few different things. You're quite analytical and action-oriented. You said your parents were very supportive. You said you can grieve in your own way, and you were taught to be resilient. It just sounds like you were raised by really good parents that had this sea of emotionally intelligent values that you got to grow up in, which you've carried with you all these years later.
I think I was very lucky that I was born into the family that I was born into. And my dad was a janitor at a school. He was a caretaker at a school. Mum was a cleaner at a school, and she owned a cafe once for a while, which she absolutely hated because she panicked every time someone came in because she was worried that they wouldn't like her food. Yeah. But they were entrepreneurial in a sense of they'd give stuff a go, and they'd always support us in what we wanted to do. But the challenge of being a young child after a brother who had passed away, in my head, when I got to about 9 or 10, I had a bit of a crisis in terms of how could I ever be as good as the brother who passed away, who was always going to be amazing because someone who's passed away. It was such a bizarre time for me, and it wasn't even my family that made me think that way. It was me putting all that pressure on myself at a young age. Can you just quantify the impact that had on you? Did it drive you? Did it make you feel anxious and panicked a lot? Did it make you feel sad? What was the impact of that comparison? I think all it did to me was make me want to do better. I talked about it with my mum. I wasn't as articulate as I am about it now because it wasn't in my thought process. Yeah. But I talked to it. And they were like, "Don't be ridiculous. It's a stupid way of thinking. That's not true. It's not the way that these things work." And they were really good at talking me through that, and getting to the point where I realised that my brother Sean was a huge part of my family and a huge part of the whole 15 years prior to me coming along. Yeah. But I was a whole new person. And what I did wasn't measured by what someone else did. Even by the age of 9 or even by the age of 5, a child can make wildly inaccurate interpretations of themselves and of life. And parents don't always realise how their children are interpreting their experiences. So, if you've got parents or if you have children, it's really worth digging in if you can to those interpretations. I know with my own children, I've said things and then later I found out that the way they interpreted, the meaning they took from what I said was so vastly different from A, what I intended, and B, what I assumed they'd interpreted, that story really goes to show that, you were so worried about, getting their approval and being as good as, and that is not at all how they were thinking about you. Rachel, you talked a little earlier about how Mark's got openness to experience running in the family. Does that correlate with grief at all? Do open people move through grief more easily, differently to people who are less open to experience? Yeah, there's quite a lot of research on the big 5 personality factors, and that being one of them. Openness to experience means you're also generally more open to internal experiences of emotion, which we know is an important part of the grief process, because protracted, complicated grief, prolonged grief can turn into depression. And very often it's because people have, bottled it up, locked it away, haven't faced it, haven't cried, haven't talked, haven't had the rituals, haven't looked at it. And so, and that can be correlated with being less open to experience. I feel that I'm in a pretty good place right now. I think the thing that I'm searching for is how to help people who have experienced similar situations to me. Mm. I've recently been accepted to join Diverse Voices Queensland, which is an LGBTQ peer support line, and I'm about to go through the training for that, and that's my first sort of step to giving back to the community to go, hey, I've gone through something very traumatic, and being able to help other people is going to be a key point to me feeling that I'm doing something.
Mark mentioned comparing himself to his brother and feeling inadequate. Is there anything you can tell us about feeling inadequate, what that really is about, and what we can do about feelings of inadequacy?
I mean, it's the nature of the mind to compare. And there's the beautiful proverb that comparison is the thief of joy. Mm. You know, because usually, you know, in psychology we talk about upward social comparison and downward social comparison, fancy names for saying, you know, oh, that person might be better than me, or I'm better than that person, neither of which are ultimately satisfying because they take us, it's the thief of joy, they take us out of our present moment experience. You know, one of the things, I've done a bit of improv that I loved about my experience with improv was it's such an accepting space. Almost anything is allowed. Mm. And whatever you bring or offer, someone will riff off that. And so not being better or worse, right or wrong, good or bad, you can really be in flow, and there's joy in that connection and in that flow. And, you know, if you're busy in improv or you know, anywhere else in your life, up in your head, comparing yourself to someone else, you lose flow.
Having gone through the very rudimentary, I'm never going to be better than my brother, now the way that I look at it is that in improv, for example, there's always going to be someone who is further along their journey, whether it's improv or comedy or career or whatever. There's always going to be someone who is further along their journey.
Always.
There's always going to be someone who's not as far along their journey. So as long as you keep moving and aspire to help the person who is not as far along their journey to move along their journey.
Yeah.
And bear in mind that you will be at some point where that next person is, then you will always be in a position where you can feel comfortable that what you're doing is good enough.
The other way I think about it is focus on your little postage stamp, your little contribution. You know, sometimes my mind can go to, you know, when I think about this podcast, I think, gosh, there's a million podcasts out there. Who do we think we are to make a podcast? Yes. You know, I want to write a book one day and I think, oh, there's a billion books in the world. It's like, well, no, I'm here. I am a human. I have a right to contribute to the world in a way that is meaningful and invigorating for me. Who cares if there's, you know, 10, 100 or a million other whatevers, you know, people doing what I'm doing. You know, if I want to contribute in that way, if that lights me up, that is all that matters.
Yeah. And doing is a great thing.
Get into doing.
Just do it.
Just take action. Yeah.
I look at my bank account sometimes and I compare myself to an arbitrary number that I haven't yet reached. And I use that arbitrary number to beat myself up. And just 3 or 4 days ago, I said, why am I thinking of this arbitrary number that I need to have in savings to? It's just I made it up and I was bashing myself for months with this number. So we just find so many different ways to psychologically beat ourselves up, comparison to people or actual invented numbers.
You just have to try and shake off those shackles of, well, it doesn't matter if I don't own a house. As long as I'm happy and I have my health and I'm comfortable and I can do the things I want to do, then why do I need to compare?
Hopefully this podcast has helped Mark Grimes, improviser and comedian and psychologist. Dr. Rachel Hannam, thank you both for coming in.
Thanks,
Thank you.